Good evening. Welcome to the Board of Selectmen meeting of March 3rd, 2016. We have somewhat of a short agenda this evening, but with a couple of meaty subject matters. And let me hop right into it. And our first agenda item is the Friends of the Dover Greenway. They have a nice presentation for us tonight. And gentlemen, why don't you introduce yourselves, please?
Sure. So my name is Alan Moss. I'm one of the board members of Friends of Dover Greenway, and together with Rob Brunn, we're here on behalf of the board to present our vision for the project to the Board of Selectmen. We've also invited, as it turns out, 2 Dover residents are also licensed site professionals who have some history and expertise in developing these trails within the state. So Ron Merrick and Paul McKinley have invited along as Dover residents to provide some input to that.
Before we begin, how long is your presentation this evening?
So we have 8 slides, so we expect 10 minutes of your time.
Very good. Thank you very much. Proceed.
Great. So if we could maybe drop the mic over there so we can show the slides. Our goal this evening is really, we have been working on this. We've been really researching this topic and advocating for it now for about 3 years. And really the goal for us this evening is to present the project to you, the selectmen, and really hopefully to get your support to move this forward. And what we specifically focused on for tonight's talk is the real 2 issues that often come up in question this. And one is the environmental aspects of it, and the second are the lease aspect of it. I think our vision, I live over in Haven Street. I've got kids in Dover schools. I'm one of the Cub Scout leaders. I've got a lot of skin in Dover's future. When I look at this, I think this is an ideal project for the town with enormous benefits and really minimal risk compared to what we're going to get back in return. Right now we have an abandoned rail corridor that's full of trash, it's full of rotting rail ties, it's overgrown. Instead, we can have a fantastic resource for the whole community to use and use for generations to come. And so I think of this really for families like mine as this is our legacy for Dover. And I ask you, the selectmen, to think of it as your legacy as selectmen for the town going forward. The benefits are, clearly often self-explanatory. There are really 4 main tangible benefits. And I think of these as, first of all, the obvious one is this is recreation for every age group, and it's very accessible. It's out your backyard. You can hop on the trail, go for a walk the dog, go for a spin on your bike with your kids. It also increases our ability to have safer in-town connections. Most errands in Dover happen within a half-mile radius of town. This is a way to avoid just hopping in the car and just hop on the trail. Go to the Dover market, go to the post office, go to the Dover library, and make those short in-town journeys. We know we've got problems with speeding cars in Dover. We've got problems with congestion at peak hours. It's a very easy way to mitigate some of those for Dover residents. There's an economic value. Young families looking at towns like Dover see this as an attraction. This enhances property values. It's what people want now. They want walkable communities, and this, for very different effort, makes Dover a much more walkable community, which is good for all of us. It maintains our property values, maintains our tax base, and maintains enrollment in our schools. There are definitely environmental benefits from having this converted. I'll give you those in a bit more detail later. And then the intangible ones are the social capital of being able to make connections with our community. I'd much rather meet my friends and neighbours on the Greenway than meet them at the transfer station, which is where we meet most of our friends and neighbours in reality. Walk out in that with your dog, meet some of your neighbours, meet your friends. All towns that do this say this really brings the town together. And there's a lot of heritage in Dover that most people do not access. Springdale is a perfect example. This parallels right along Springdale, right along Wildwood, places most people in Dover often don't get to go, and this provides a very easy way to access those. So let's go to the specific questions that the selectmen have asked us in the past about. Firstly, the environmental question. We really see this as an environmental advantage for the town. Right now, we have, by calculation, over 1,000 creosote ties rotting into the soil in Dover from this railbed. The first thing this will do is take them all up as part of the conversion. We know that these can leach into the soil, and we know that their average lifespan is 35 years, and the ties in Dover right now have been there for God knows how long, and they're rotting. The second thing this trail will do is you take up all the ties so they're no longer an environmental hazard, and you cap the soil with stone dust. And the Mass DEP will state, and maybe ask my colleagues here who are experts, this is the best way to approach these abandoned rail beds, is capping the stone dust. And all the soil and the stuff that's been there for over 100 years is entombed, if you like, and is going nowhere. And we know from the report that Beals and Thomas gave the town that the process itself does not expose any risk to the town, because essentially the process is an enclosed process where everything that's there is entombed inside you and nothing is moved around, or the process is done to do the conversion is done by best practices according to Mass DEP, and that really contains and isolates any soil that's there. So there are the environmental advantages. If we can go on to the next slide, and thankfully the existing conditions for us in Dover are very favourable. The soil from 100 years of railroad use is not visually contaminated, and there have been no state-reported contamination incidents anywhere on the trail over the last 100 years. So that gives us some reassurance in terms of what's likely to be there. In terms of water and wells, this has come up before. We've contacted the Dover Board of Health. There are no reports of anyone who abuts the rail trail having reported contaminated wells to date. Colonial Water, who have the largest water source in town, that runs right under the trail on Canalville Drive, they produce annual reports to the Mass of the state, and none of those show any contamination with lead, copper, aluminium, or chlorides, or anything you might expect from contamination. And that's done annually at 10 different sites. So that is certainly very reassuring that the existing conditions are very favorable, the water is safe, and the soil has no visual or reported contamination. That said, if the selectmen feel in doing this process that they want to be even more secure, then sometimes they're taking on environmental insurance to cover any other possibilities that are not covered there. The typical costs are $40,000 to $50,000. It's subsidized by the state, so half is paid for by the state from this Opposite Business Development Fund. And that gives you $3 million coverage for 5 years, which is really the term of the construction process. And we would suggest that if this is something that the selectmen are in favour of, that the FPG would raise the funds and provide those funds to the town as part of the fundraising package to cover the insurance also. So for those 3 reasons, we see really environmentally this is a very favourable project compared to other towns, and including the insurance, then that covers all the risks for the town in terms of liability or financial risks.
So before we move on, we know this is a very, very important issue, so we want to kind of test whether or not anything we said today was unexpected to you, whether or not there's anything you have questions about, and specifically since we have licensed site professionals here at the meeting, to the extent you have technical questions or want to confirm what we've stated in the presentation, you've got an opportunity to put those questions directly to them.
That's great, please.
So if I recall the open hearing, I think if I recall correctly, Beals and Thomas was suggesting that maybe we did want to do some baseline testing. So that's, and I may not recall correctly.
So you're right, they did put that in their report. Now interestingly, if you look at this Department of Environmental Protection in Massachusetts, they do not recommend testing for these kind of trails. If you look at their algorithm, rural trails in this kind of environment, they do not recommend testing. According to the lease, you can't test anyway until you've taken the lease. So that recommendation is there. It goes against the normal recommendations for these rail trail conversions. I don't know if either Ron or Paul have any experience with that.
Sure, yeah, Paul Kinley again, 17 Cedar Hills, where I live.
I thought you looked familiar.
Yeah.
You were the crazy guy riding in shorts yesterday.
That was two girls, yeah. I definitely did not anticipate how cold it was.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, I am a licensed site professional. I do actively do rail trail work. I do a lot with the company that I work in. And I do environmental work at the Line Extension, the South Coast Rail Project, and I'm one of the MBTA's on-call consultants. So you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find an environmental consultant that does more track work than me in Massachusetts. I work with best management practices and policy. I talk to the author who loves that policy. I use it so much. And it's a practical approach to deal with any potential residual contamination that's on a rail corridor like this. So in a rural, setting such as this, the intent of the policy is to actually avoid testing. That was, you came up with a crafty way to sort of avoid in these long linear projects to address the contamination, address any risk that could potentially be there. I'm not sure if it's there or not, but this is just a practical approach with avoiding testing. Testing, in this instance, really isn't warranted if you follow that protocol and policy. It's for urban areas or areas with, a higher likelihood of significant impacts that could cause a risk. So if you're following that DEP policy, actually testing is really not the path of that policy.
Is that policy applicable to a community that relies on its water source through wells, or is it municipal water supplies, or does it apply to both?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. This would apply to both communities that is generating water, potable water from the wells, and the contaminants that we're dealing with here a little bit. Juan can jump to this, but it's really soil contamination issue, right? So if you're, as a hit on, this contamination has been there. If it is there for a very long time, the system is probably in equilibrium, and so if it was going to impact the groundwater, or it would. So this is really a soil issue. It's a superficial soil. The contaminants are generally non-mobile. They're metals, etc., and wouldn't lend themselves to impacting groundwater. So really, the rail trail policy and the type of contaminants that you deal with in a rail setting is really a soil contamination issue, and that's where encapsulating it with stone dust eliminates the exposure. And our regulations, we deal with risk, and so that would eliminate any potential exposure if there was contamination.
Now, I understand if we just cap the whole thing, including all rail ties, all the way, 12 feet wide, all the way down for 3 miles, but now if you pull up the ties, you disturb that soil. Talk to me about what happens, what that disturbance is, and how do you encapsulate that disturbance?
Yeah. So as Alan, hit at, you're actually removing some of the sources of potential contamination, the ties, and then you're encapsulating any residual impacts that would be there if they were there. So you're essentially improving conditions, but when you do construction, that is where there may be an increased risk exposure, dust, right? The workers' dust, maybe neighbors, and that's where there's, and it even references in the DEP policy, there's some really concrete and easy steps that you take. You monitor dust, this little handhold, monitor dust, and this over EPA action levels. You address it. You spread water on it. It's really simple, very, very simple to do. It's something that we do, often in any construction project in a contaminated or potentially contaminated area. It's just, best practices. Really easy to do. You just spread the water on the dust and knock it down.
I appreciate that at the point of construction. I'm thinking about long-term. I know Beals and Thomas brought up the question of anyone who accessed the rail trail, say from their own backyard, creating an erosion place, and clearly is talking about spreading contamination as that stone dust is disturbed and whatever is beneath it has a chance to run into people's backyards.
Yeah, so there should be a maintenance element to this to make sure that you're not eliminating the stone dust or exposing areas that are potentially contaminated. And typically in these rail corridors, it's a pretty narrow band, right? So it's the rail corridor, and they do a lot of the contaminants are associated with devegetation, vegetation control programs, lead arsenate, and it's a narrow band. They don't have to do a large swath. It's pretty narrow, and where the access is generally it's a 12-foot corridor and narrow in some instances. So maintenance of those caps is an element that needs to be incorporated, but it really is pretty simple to do. And the contamination is there now, right? So this project would be an improvement to the current conditions.
Well, except that to beg the question, no one is accessing it. So, the difference is if you have an attractive rail trail and you have small children, they're probably going to want to run right through right up on it, and there you have another path. The other question I had is around herbicides, the things that were used on either side of the rail trail. I hear about the heavy metals, but what about the DDT and all of the things that were used over the years?
So, the historical testing, it's typically lead and arsenic that is a result of the herbicides. Those are the residual contaminants that we typically detect when we're doing the testing on these. When we're generating soil on any project, export, and when tested, those are the contaminants. Sometimes it's what's called polyaromatic hydrocarbons, maybe some metal, some other metals, some drips and drabs from the train, but generally those are the contaminants. So, as far as the testing, I've looked at a lot of databases, those pesticides and those compounds typically are not present. Not at the frequency of that.
Ron Meyer, 11 Belden Road. I think another thing we need to look at is this policy. It's not a new policy. We're not recreating the wheel with this policy. It's been in effect for, I think it was Kerry Healy, and it was part of signing this. So when you consider something that's been in place now for over a decade, and Mass DEP is a very conservative agency. They don't put policies out that are potentially detrimental to public health. Their job is to protect public health. So to put out a policy that isn't consistent with protecting public health is not consistent with their approach ever, and it would have been rescinded a long time ago. So that's from the 20,000-foot view, is that this isn't something that hasn't been done before in places just like Dover across the state. And in the end, the outcome is significantly better than the existing from an environmental standpoint. You might be removing ties, and the thought is, well, maybe now we're mobilizing something that can leach through. No, the particles, the contaminants that are in that matrix are tied up there and stabilized over time. And by removing the timbers, you're taking away what could add to that and contribute to a mass loading over time that then rain goes through. So now a lot of that is being eliminated. So from an environmental perspective, I asked Paul, he does a lot more of these type of projects. I'm like, is the environmental side a typical concern? He's like, it really isn't. He doesn't see that as being a major concern. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be. Everyone should look at it. But the information out there and the studies that DEP has done and the policy they've put together is solid science, and it protects public health.
So I think the big concern is, that the MBTA clearly says you can't test. So then it begs the question, well, what are you hiding? So, and I think that's the catalyst for a lot of the concern.
Right. Well, they do that across the whole state. They said, this is our policy. If you want the trail, take it. If you're in Cambridge and it's at a rail yard, or if you're in the Alston rail yard, you want it, you got to deal with what's there. And that's just their blanket policy.
As a selectman, and I'll just speak on my behalf right now, I have to rely on a lot of experts that we hire to tell us what we should do in a lot of instances in town, quite honestly. And where Beals and Thomas has recommended up to, I think it's 40 tests, if I'm correct, I have to listen to that very strongly. Now, I'm not hearing the great reason why we shouldn't do that. Well, that throws me into a flux, so to speak. Why should I enter into a lease before I can do something that my expert has recommended that I do? I'm trying to reconcile to get to the middle here. And I know, you asked about the environmental technical question, but now it's transferred to the lease issue.
No, understood. And I didn't get the sense that Beals and Thomas was recommending that we test before entering into the lease, because I think they're pretty clear on the process.
Yeah, that's right. I'm clear on the process, too.
From my perspective, I think testing is very much an implementation question. And if Dover wants to do the testing that's recommended by Beals and Thomas as part of how we develop the trail here, that doesn't give me a whole lot of heartburn. Because again, the evidence is that we're not going to find anything that is terribly problematic, because there are no records of spills, especially along the path that's heading through the woods. And as a rural railroad that didn't get a whole lot of use, there's not reason to believe. And also, I think the visual inspections that Beals and Thomas did as they walked the trail didn't note areas where vegetation clearly wasn't growing that may indicate the presence of contamination that is disrupted the ecosystem. So if it's the right thing for the town to do, to test, then I think we test, because ultimately what we're likely to find will require us to pull up the ties and cap it with stone dust. which is exactly the proposed construction methodology in accordance with Mass DEP, best management practices. So I think it won't necessarily change the trajectory of the project, and if it's the right thing to do for peace of mind for the town, then I think that's a very reasonable implementation position to take.
That has been our standing operating procedure when we get involved in any of these type of land transactions, that we test for that. And now, I believe you said that there'd be money, possible monies raised to buy the insurance. Okay? What about if we went ahead and signed the lease and did 40 tests or whatever it takes to appease all the abutters, and there's something found? I would probably look to shelve financial responsibility in an agreement prior to entering into a lease where taxpayers wouldn't have to pay for this remediation. It would be through donor monies rather than buying the insurance.
So you're saying that post-hoc, if the testing found something you want to do something about, you would go back to private donors to address?
Well, I'd go back to the friends by the side agreement that we signed prior to doing this,
Right.
and saying that you've a lifelong agreement to fix any environmental issues.
Right.
So I see that as an alternative as we talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think if that's a concern, I think... the
Absolutely,
environmental
spending the
insurance-
taxpayers' dollars are a concern.
Absolutely. No, I think if the testing results are a concern, then the insurance is the solution to it. Because that covers whatever you may find. And if you look at the record...
Only for a number of years, though, is that correct?
It's for 5 years,
Right.
right? So the 5 years, and that base is for the construction period. Because if you're going to find anything, that's when you find it, right? Is during the construction period. You're not going to find it after you've capped everything and entombed it. To actually come back to the previous point about disrupting the trail, it's being disrupted right now. People have pulled up the metal ties and the rails already in Wild Woods. People are disrupting it right now without any protection. So if we're worried about disrupting the soil, you go down the trail now 2 miles, someone's pulled up the ties already, someone's pulled up the rails, and that soil's being exposed, and we've no control over it.
Yeah.
So how many towns have actually collected on their insurance policy?
So we know that we contacted 12 towns over the last 6 months. We know so far Newton and Needham have taken their insurance policy. All the other towns chose not to, because they felt the risk was so low.
I understood Newton doubled their insurance.
You can double it. I mean, what the town does in terms of how much they invest in it, typically it's a $50,000, the state will pay half of it. Needham took it out with AIG, or negotiating with AIG now, Newton took it out. Most of the towns did not, because their advice was that the risk here is so low, it's not worth doing. If you look, there's 46 rail trails in Massachusetts. There are only 5 reports of any soil testing reported to the state where there are abnormal results. And of those 4 were after the development of the trail, where people either spilled oil on the trail from nearby from trucks. There's an Eversource truck crashed on one trail. So all those reports are after the trail was developed, not from having actually developed the trail. The trail was the actual abnormal result. And the one positive result when it was tested after this was taken was about 10 feet from a garage petrol station. So I think if you look, the vast bulk of the data suggests that it's unlikely you'll find anything abnormal here, but if you do, you've got insurance to cover that, because the time you'll find it is during the construction process.
You said the state pays 50% of that? I wasn't aware of that. I was, I
There's a
forgot
fund
about
from
it.
the Office of Business Development, and they pay half of the cost of the insurance, up to $50,000. And that was in the,
Through a grant?
through a grant.
Okay.
Yeah. That was in 2006, that was made law. Because it was just based to encourage towns to do this, when
Right.
the concern was these very concerns about risk. They said, okay, we'll provide funds to half the cost of the insurance.
You know, you should be very aware that our role is to listen to the townspeople and then respond to how they vote, whether to enter into the lease. I mean, at some point, if this question goes to town meeting, well, is it to authorize the Board of Selectmen to enter into a lease? You know, so we're trying to dot all the i's and cross all the t's and anticipate all the questions, especially the abutters. You know, so that's how, really, that's why we're asking these type of questions.
And we would expect you to do the due diligence, and that's why we're here to really kind of unearth some of those answers in that part of that process. And everything we've put here, we've got the references. You can search the website yourself and find the same information.
Yeah, very good.
One of the questions that I have is about the length of the lease. And one of the areas that makes me so very uncomfortable is 99 years just sounds like forever.
Right. Well, actually, we have 2 slides on the lease. Do you want us to?
And strangely enough, the duration of the lease is the first bullet.
Good question.
So you've heard these questions.
We try to listen as well.
So we've actually we are pro owner clients of Ropes and Gray. We've had their real estate attorney review this lease to look at, how it compares to other leases around the state. So if we could maybe drop the lights so I can kind of show you the slides. So first of all, I think the first thing to realize is this lease that they've put together is very much for the MBTA's benefit.
Yes.
And it really is standard lowest base for the whole state. There are not variations that's going around for each county. This is just their standard lease. The reason that the 99-year term is picked really is because they can't really give the land away. It's public land, there are easement issues. So the best they can do is give a long-term lease. From our point of view from the towns, if we go to the trouble of developing this trail, we don't want to go back in 10 years or 20 years. We want to get the value from it. From their point of view, it's as good as giving it away, but they can't actually give the land away for various legal reasons, a public entity.
So with respect to the term, I guess, as I've heard concerns raised about it, it's often in the context of who can say what's going to happen over the course of a century. Even though a trail running through the woods should be a fairly low-risk asset, if we take the lease, we're on the hook for the next 4 generations, and something certainly could happen that requires a response over that period of time. So it's low risk, but candidly, whatever's going to happen out of the trail is going to happen whether we take the lease or not. And if there's some problem that's going to arise over the course of the next century, I think we feel a heck of a lot better if Dover can control the response to it. And if we can make sure that it's this group or if it's the town government that is making sure that however that problem is dealt with in a way that's going to work for the citizens of Dover. I feel a lot better about that if it's happening in 50 or 60 years than relying on the MBTA to take care of the problem. Because we can see now what they're willing to invest in this corridor. So I think having control could actually be a tremendous benefit to the town in the event that the unforeseen, unnameable bad thing happens. And so we see controlling the corridor as being a benefit in that regard.
Because they've really abandoned it. It's in our town, but they've abandoned it and left it to, they don't maintain it, they don't inspect it. It's just rotting away and overgrown, and yet it's right in the middle of our town. We should take control and be able to remediate those issues like the rotting tide and soil.
A fascinating perspective on it that I hadn't thought about what MBTA has allowed to happen down there versus controlling our own
We
destiny.
have to tell MBTA when people from other towns are accessing their property, I'm thinking specifically of the bridge. When the folks from Needham cut through the fence, MBTA, they're waiting on us to tell them that that's happened so that we can do something about it. I think controlling this asset and being able to do with it something that really works for Dover seems to us to be just a tremendous benefit rather than relying on the MBTA to do anything ever.
I have a question, the last term of the termination rights. I'm sorry, I can't quite see the last line. It says restoration, something as is. Does that mean that we would have to put the rails back?
No, so one of the concerns was we have to put them back. So we've spoken to Needham because they've gone through the process.
Right.
They negotiations with the MBTA were told, no, we just want the trail back as is, which means as you have left.
As it would be.
Oh, as is.
Okay,
As
so
As we have left.
the lease is not very clear to that, though.
Well, the lease gives them the ability to require a town to return the corridor to its original grade.
Grade's the issue, right?
So they have the ability to require that. It's not automatic in the lease. And what Needham has reported back to us as their town has been negotiating with the MBTA is that the MBTA said that they don't have any intention of requiring that if they pull the corridor back for public transportation purposes, that they would simply take it as it is at that point in time. In fact, you're right, it's not very clear the way we wrote that bullet,
Yeah.
but
It's as is at the time if they ever wanted that.
the key bullet there is that in the highly unlikely chance that they do want the corridor back, we don't see it being a financial risk to the town, having to hand it back over in terms of having to restore it to prior conditions.
That'll be in the side letter, too.
So I think it's useful that a lot of the towns have gone through this discussion and clarified these points. They're the responses they're getting back, but you only get them back when you actually do the lease negotiation with MBTA. It's also important to note that we've been told all along this lease is unnegotiable, but the precedent has been set recently where Wayland have been able to alter some of the terms of the lease in their negotiations with the MBTA. So that precedent is now there for a town like Dover to say, look, for us this is critical. Now, you may not be able to get out of the environmental liability, but there may be some things that you may say, this is critical for us, and Wayland have done that.
And we
Well, I
don't-
would like to see that Wayland contract somehow, or the excerpts that you're talking about.
No, absolutely, and we don't want to overstate the case here. I think it may be nothing more than a glimmer of light. And I do know that DCR negotiated the lease on Wayland's behalf, and it took a considerable period of time to get it done with the MBTA. However, the MBTA made concessions, and that is now going to be a matter of public record, and it's a precedent contract that I would think Dover or other towns that are subsequently negotiating with the MBTA could use to particularly sand off some of the rough edges.
Absolutely. That's very good.
I think one last slide, because I don't want to take too much of the time. One of the questions often comes up is, do we have to convert the entire corridor from the bridge to Hunt Drive? In terms of the lease, leave it up to the town to determine the time and restrictions of use to the public. And so we would suggest with selecting that that is the point at which we can say, if the selectmen decide, we're more comfortable going Haven Street or Springdale South and not north, that part would be either left as is. There are maybe concerns there, as we said, about leaving all those rolling ties behind, but maybe take up the ties but not open it as a public trail. And certainly we are conscious that the most concentrated development is along that part of the trail. And if the end point was that we get a trail from the town south, that for us that would be an acceptable compromise if that's required. And so in the terms of the lease to negotiate that point with the MBTA on the restriction of how far the trail goes.
I'm glad you addressed that, because that's been something I've talked about since day one, about where it should start and what the value of that quarter of a mile is to the railroad bridge, which just invites trouble.
So I think the very important takeaway here is that the selectmen and that the town will have flexibility to determine the right way to implement this project for the town. And again, if that is limiting usage, limiting access on certain portions, prohibiting access on certain portions in order to focus folks, say, if you get Springdale South to Medfield, which is by far the prettiest part of the trail, not just because it goes past my backyard. I think that's a huge win for the town, and it is a way of respecting the concerns of others, particularly north of Haven Street, along Center, along Haven Terrace, and hopefully finding an acceptable compromise that assuages their fears about privacy, but still allows the town to create this benefit for the folks here.
So maybe we'll finish before taking any additional questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, your 10 minutes are almost up.
I have is the last slide here is, so I think a question you may ask yourself is, what if we do nothing? Right? What if we know Dover resistance to change? You don't have anything to change within Dover. But I think here is a change that is truly of enormous benefit to the town, without too much disruption to the character or the nature of the town. Because we're quite cognizant that Dover needs to stay as Dover is, as a rural environment, and this is perfect for that. So if we do nothing, what happens? The corridor remains neglected, the ties continue to rot, the soil gets disrupted by people who are doing God knows what down in wild woods. We have no control over that. We miss a huge opportunity to give all the town a recreation resource for every age group. If you look at towns that have this, half the people who use the trail do more exercise after the trail's put in than beforehand. And we have a huge obesity problem here. This is a very easy way to give everyone in Dover a chance to use this opportunity. And finally, and this always makes me nervous, we have fast, narrow roads. When I see my neighbors walking their dogs, or my neighbors with their kids on their bikes, it makes me really nervous. Look at the Dover Town Report, every week there's people being run off the road. This is an extremely safe corridor to get around Dover that puts no one at risk. And I would hate to see us miss this and see someone killed on our roads because they could have been using the rail trail in the future. So there are our thoughts. This is a great quote from a police chief in Massachusetts. He really felt many of the things most people feel when they hear about this, and then look back and say, you know what, this is the best thing our town ever did.
Is this the police chief in Milton?
We don't know. We don't know.
Milford, maybe?
The Rail Trail Committee,
Uh-huh.
I think working with Chief McGowan, surveyed
Uh-huh.
chiefs anonymously. So we know the quote came back, but we don't know exactly from where. And that is, by the way, that's a picture of the Needham Trail at Fisher Street looking south towards Dover. And they will actually be opening their trail on May 1st, the day before town meeting.
Well, it's a very good presentation. And what I break it down to, and I'm a very simple-minded person, the tangible versus the intangible. The tangible aspects of the lease and possible water supply contamination. Okay? The intangible about safety, about recreation, about getting control of the land. There are great arguments on both sides. And on one side, I'm a businessman, and I can tell you what I'm going to do with the lease. If you were in your office, right?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much. But the intangibles weigh heavily in this. And I hope you really concentrate. You've answered great questions, but I hope you concentrate on the intangibles if you really want to make this thing happen.
And certainly, thank you very much for that feedback. But since you mentioned the water supply, and I don't know that we addressed that specifically, I will just say, and certainly Ron and Paul come over the top of me if I misstate things. We've spoken with both Mike and George at the Board of Health, and they had significant doubts that if there's ground level contamination, even if it got into the groundwater, that contamination could get into private wells and foul wells because of the way the wells are constructed, because of the sheer distance between ground level contamination and where the aquifers are. So I don't think there's a whole lot of practical concern that this project could foul wells or would be a threat to the water supply. Is that a true statement?
Yeah. This is not a contaminant, these aren't contaminants that are particularly mobile.
Okay.
They're contaminants that soil onto soil particles, and that's where they're going to stay for the most part. Migration concerns from these type of contaminants are generally migration from erosion going to an area. And so capping deals with the primary concern. Paul, do you have any other thoughts on that?
The project, if the contamination is there, then it would impact us. This project is at best improving the quality, removing some of the sources, and it's not going to exacerbate anything that may be there presently, which is unlikely. So again, this is mostly a soil issue in general. When we look at rail trails, it's a soil issue. Very rarely does it impact groundwater. But again, the project as proposed, or any rail trail project, really isn't exacerbating a groundwater condition, even in the remote chance that it would exist. And let me just one last thing on the sampling. Let me just say the policy on the sampling, just to hammer this home. The policy actually, with the capping, actually presumes that the testing is actually going to find something, and the capping is a proactive approach that we use on contaminated sites to limit the exposure to soil contamination. So again, that sampling that was proposed by Beals and Thomas, I think they're misapplying the policy. Again, the policy is presuming that there's some contamination there, and the approach is to encapsulate it. So again, you're already jumping past, I guess, the doom and gloom, and in this type of rail corridor, you wouldn't expect a hotspot or a high level of contamination. So again, that's a proactive approach, and so the sampling is really something we should talk about is the implementation. that the policy indicates is not warranted.
Good. Is this the same presentation at the warrant committee's open hearing in a couple of weeks?
So we've tailored this to selectmen because the concerns were raised. We have a more intangible benefit presentation for the warrant
I look
committee.
forward to seeing that then.
Yeah, no, our sense is that they're likely to be folks there who aren't quite as familiar with the project as the selectmen are. And we want to make sure, this was, again, there wasn't much of the soaring vision, you know, the dream of what this could be for the town. You know, but we understand that the selectmen's need to focus on the practical matters and to make sure that the i's are dotted and the t's are crossed. And so that's how we wanted to focus this time.
Very good.
Forgive us for
No, it was very good, thank you. Candace, anything else?
No, I just have, my last remark to make is, you know, it's wonderful that we are addressing sort of and trying to contain, pardon the pun, but to contain the liability over the next few years. I think I can't help but jump ahead and wonder what the liability would be to the town over the 85 years after that. You know, in other words, I worry about the long-term effects that we don't have any data on other communities and some of the other issues that could arise. And because it's an unknown, obviously I don't want to be so conservative that we just don't move on something that could be of benefit to the community. And on the other hand, it's such an enormous liability chance to put our successors in that position, to put Mr. Ramsey in that position, to put all of the taxpayers in Dover in that position for years and years and years to come. That's really where my head still goes.
Thank you, Candace. Robin?
I just wanted to say that I think you did a very good job addressing the concerns that I heard, particularly at the open hearing or the presentation of the report by Beals and Company. I would strongly recommend that whatever presentation you make at the open hearing addresses those concerns as well, so that there isn't the perception that we're burying our head in the sand. I think one point that I would emphasize that wasn't emphasized this evening is that the remediation for contamination such as this is containment. Because, you know, I think when people think of environmental remediation, they're thinking of pumping and treating, and to me, which goes on into perpetuity, and that can get really expensive. And the other thing is maybe to give a little bit of history with respect to environmental law and what has happened over time. I know way back at the beginning, having had some experience with this, you know, your remedy had to restore your contamination to the way God created it, so to speak. And now I think there's been a much more common sense approach to environmental remediation. Again, to Candace's point, we can't say that it's always going to be this way, but I know a lot of remediation basically wants you to restore the land so that it can be used for something. So I would just add some of that to.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very nice presentation, I might add.
Yeah, very,
Thank you, gentlemen.
and that
Thank you.
link that somebody sent was very good.
The movie.
Yeah, the movie,
Yeah,
yeah,
excellent.
very
I
good.
recommend that on the big screen, as we say.
We didn't want to waste too much of our 10 minutes.
Who did the beautiful photography flying along the, it's
Yeah,
it's
it's nice.
beautiful.
Wasn't me, I know.
Nobody with a selfie stick.
Beautiful.
Again, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll get back to the agenda. And our next agenda item is to approve buy-recycle policy for the town of Dover. Now, who can speak to this, if anybody wants to?
I may, Mr. Chairman.
Please, thank you.
The Recycling Committee has asked the board to consider the approval of a buy recycle policy. It's a precondition for subsequent grant applications that the Recycling Committee may want to get permission from the selectmen to apply for. Greer and I have looked at it. We don't see any problems with it. We pretty much do it now.
Pretty much do it now. Okay, so the grants they're applying for are the carpet and mattress recycling incentives, pay-as-you through program costs, pay-as-you-go, I call it, and recycling dividends.
Yeah, these are prospective grants that they may apply for in the future, but they can't do that without this policy being in.
Okay. This is the first time I've seen it, I believe, and I could be wrong.
It is, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I prefer to push this off so I can read the whole thing in its entirety versus reading it out loud at a selectmen's meeting.
Fair enough.
I don't know how you feel.
I'm glad you said that, because my head is throbbing, and I haven't been able to
Okay.
get past like
Right.
2 or 3
But
bullet
think
points.
that's a great
with
idea.
respect to the recycling committee, who worked very hard, we will put it on our next agenda
Right.
to answer it.
Okay.
So I hope the recycling committee understands that. Thank you for that.
Well,
Okay, yes.
is there a deadline for the grants? Will
That's a
we-
good question.
Okay.
And again, this is a precondition. They would have to come back pursuant to your policy to ask for permission to apply for a grant, so there's no
Okay.
deadline.
All right, okay.
Okay, thank you for that. Patience, Recycling Committee. Into other business on the agenda, we have a reserve fund transfer for workmen's compensation. Dave, is this also, or is this a Greer
This
item?
is Mrs. Puget.
Greer, please, I know you like to get on TV.
So much. The town's insurer, Maya, recently conducted its mid-year payroll audit.
Yep.
At that time, they determined the total number of employees that were covered under our premium and their salaries, and an adjustment was made. The town owes a total of $7,362 in additional premium. In the budget, we have only $3,540.74 remaining. So we are asking for a reserve fund transfer of the difference, which is $3,821.26.
So this audit, this is a result of the audit that's not so much on the anticipated salaries and the workman's compensation insurance, but the loss experience?
They look at both, and
Right.
we have had an increase in our loss experience. We have 2 ongoing total disability claims at this point, so adjustments were made for that as well.
Okay.
So just as a side note, in anybody's experience, have you ever seen this adjusted down? I never have.
Actually,
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, but we've had years
Never.
where we were not charged.
Right,
additional.
right.
Yeah, right, that's a good
But you
point.
know, if you can bump it up, you should be able to say, well, your premium's been reduced for the next 6
Yeah.
months. I've never seen that happen.
That's a good point. That's an excellent point. Greer, thank you for that explanation. I don't have any further questions. That, Candace or Robin?
I
I
don't
have no
either.
question.
I asked my question.
Okay, then, hearing no questions, I'll make the motion that we approve the request for transfer from the reserve fund in the amount of $3,821.26 for workers' compensation. Do I hear a second?
Second,
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
just you.
Thank you. Next agenda item is a prior notice, the Veteran Services. Now, I believe, Dave, this is you.
It is, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
We have been notified by our veterans agent, Mr. Paul Carew, that he has, in fact, an eligible veteran who will need approximately $6,500 in aid. So this is a prior notice. As you recall, in our budget, we have to carry $1,000 every year To my knowledge, we've never spent a nickel. This is the first claim since I've been in Dover.
So a present Dover resident is making a claim for certain payments under the Mass General Law, Chapter 115?
Yes.
Okay. And this is through our Veterans Service Agent, Mr. Carew?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, and due to confidentiality, I imagine I shouldn't ask too many other questions, other than I'm very familiar with the Veteran Services, and for the few people who need it, it's well worth it.
I agree.
I don't have any questions or anything, and I guess we will vote to accept the prior notices? Yes, so I'll make the motion that we vote to accept this prior notice for the Veteran Services in the amount of
Second that.
$6,500.
I'll second that again.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Robert, again. Under other business, we have special licenses, and this evening we have 5 of them. Thank you, Mona, for the summary, as usual. I will
Social
read-
system, the social scene is picking up.
That's very true.
Certainly
Very
is.
true. I will read the 5, then we'll vote on all 5 at once. The first one is April 1st. No, it's not, it's an April Fool's joke. No.
See, you stole my joke. Is it or is it not going to happen? Maybe that's why they have the April 2nd one, too.
Well, there's a reception at the Connors Center on that evening. On April 2nd, also at the Connors Center, and it looks like a continuation of the same reception. April 12th at the Connors Center, there is a dinner for a Catholic Education Conference. On April 15th, the BC Law School retreat is at the Connors Center. And again, the next night, on April 16th, the same situation, the BC Law retreat dinner is at the Connors Center. I'll make a motion that we approve all 5 special licenses as read. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you for that. And I forgot to say that the chief has approved all 5.
Thanks. Get past it.
What's that? 2. Thank you, Candace.
3.
This is each.
Thank you. Good. Thank you for that. And as we roll forward into our next agenda item, which is always my favorite, citizens' comments. This evening, we have our usual attendant, that's nice, he bought season tickets to the Board of Selectmen's meeting, so he shows up. Mr. Lawrence, who's chair of our warrant, would you like to, any comments before we,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have comments at this time.
thank you. Well, with that, Robin, or Candace, any comments at all?
Not tonight.
Very good.
I would
Go ahead,
like
please.
to remind everybody of the town caucus on Monday night.
Excellent point. And
Actually, I take that back.
The open hearing.
Everyone's open hearing on March 14th, 7:30 in the Great Hall.
Right, so it's a week from
7:30.
Monday.
A week from Monday.
Right.
what time is the caucus Monday evening?
7?
Police,
7 PM, and that's in the Great Hall? Very good. Thank you, Robin, for that. Thank you, Doug.
I have one thing that I just wanted to say. I thought that was a wonderful presentation tonight.
The Friends of the Greenway?
Yes, the
They
Friends
did
of
an
the
excellent
Greenway.
job.
And I think this is just such a serious issue that faces the town. I sympathize, I know that people are very, very invested in particular outcomes, and I think that it is a complicated issue with lots of pros and cons on both sides. And I thought that they handled the questions admirably. I agree with you, Robin, I think when they go to the open hearing, that they'll be well advised to talk about, as you said, kind of the ineffable, sort of the intangibles, but as you said as well, to answer some of these questions that other people will have on environment and the terms of the lease.
Because these were the concerns I heard at their presentation of the report by Beals and Thomas.
Right. So anyway, I just was thinking about it. It was a fine presentation, and I look forward, we'll hear it a couple more times, I'm sure, and I look forward to it.
And for the record, that was the longest 10 minutes.
Very well said. With that, I don't hear any other comments. I'll make a motion for adjournment this evening then. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you and good night.